My name's Soren Reichelt, and each month at Secure Agility, we run another webinar around cloud, looking at things like security, optimization of cloud, the migration to cloud, all different types of topics around cloud computing. And today's webinar with Fortinet is really centered around the changes that are happening to critical infrastructure and the classification of what is critical infrastructure in Australia. And we thought it was important to maybe just unpack that a little bit in terms of what does that mean, critical infrastructure? What will it mean for organizations? And how can businesses go on a journey to, I guess, start countering these cyber threats to operational technologies and IoT? So our webinar today is about 30 minutes. What we hope for you guys to get out of it today is an understanding of what that change or the classification of critical infrastructure means. And ways to approach raising your maturity to be able to counter these cyber threats as well. In terms of who we have guiding us on this journey today, so Andrew Sheedy from Fortinet, Director of Operational Technologies. Just as a bit of a background, I guess, of Fortinet, huge strategic partner for Secure Agility, one of the largest security vendors, globally, helping organizations to, I guess, not only address cyber threats, but also looking at different technologies that assess all manner of security across the stack. Andrew, I'm interested to hear, I mean, just as an overview from Fortinet, why do customers choose to work with Fortinet? They're not limited for choice. What's that reason in your mind do you think customers work with you guys?
Look, I think it's a number of factors. So my background started over 25 years ago. I built a winery in the Barossa Valley, and I realised as soon as I had a couple 100,000 litres of wine fermenting that me and my trusty thermometer were just not good enough. So I built my first control system. For all intents, it was held together with string and rubber bands. But at no time during that process did I really consider cybersecurity and the ramifications of what that would mean, because we were using spreadsheets and manual things to collate data. And wind forward 25 years, the whole evolution of applications to control or to manage process control has evolved to the point where the application to run a winery can now be cloud-born. It can monitor tanks, inventory, payroll, staff, all kinds of general ledger functions, including operational zones from the cloud. And people can run businesses from iPads and IoT. So I think that whole advance in technology, whilst it's been substantial and certainly makes life a lot easier to run an organization, it's created a whole lot of different kinds of threats, and particularly around cybersecurity. And one of those things that is great to be at Fortinet for is that our value proposition is built on a holistic approach. So we've developed a complete fabric of products from core firewalls to applications that enable organizations to deploy advanced technology to manage their environment, and then use our technology to help glue all of that technology together and make it secure enough so that we know that the right people at the right time are accessing the right systems. So it's not a simple answer because in itself, you need a complex solution to solve a complex problem that's multifaceted.
Yeah, and it's great to have that. No, it's great to have that experience, right? And we look forward to sort of you, I guess, unpacking critical infrastructure, what that means, and talking a little bit about operational technologies and IoT and how that's really transforming things in this webinar. So thanks for making the time for us today as well. It's always appreciated when we get to go through these topics with people who've had that experience. So look, what I wanted to do is just maybe start with a little bit of, IoT, and you touched on it there, looking at things like these new technologies to help automation, process systems, getting access to data and bits and pieces. Organizations are using those to innovate and improve their business processes. As a holistic, I guess, view of Australia from your perspective, working at the coalface at Fortinet, how prepared do you think Australian organisations are to really leverage these technologies securely?
It's a great question. I think we've got a really broad spectrum of security competency and capability from organisations. The customers that I'm talking to are We've got people at the very start of the journey that are just starting to embrace cloud-borne applications to help them with ops. And we've got other organizations that have been embracing it for a few years. They've used multiple standards and frameworks to be able to build out their checklist of things that they need to do in order to be secure. And they've done a really good job of putting that together. Others, potentially a bit like me, started out, have just done really well at doing things, getting their systems up and running so that their process control is as stable as possible. And they don't want anybody to touch it, and they don't want anybody to interfere with it, because downtime is just, it's a dirty word. They're not interested in downtime. So anything that's going to stop ops, they're not doing. But so I think what's happened is that the regulation that we're starting to see come in with the Act is going to be to help organisations that haven't progressed that journey very far yet, to give them a set of a framework and a set of guiding principles to embrace, and also enable government departments that are authorised appropriately to help or step in and help in the advent of a cyber incident.
Yeah, and these core points across here on this slide are pretty good, right? Like, if you think about it, a lot of businesses haven't had to think about cybersecurity and looking at that from an operational technology perspective. Some of the systems, as you've said before, may have been in place for 20 years. So, what do we now need to look at? Or if we are changing that and connecting it to networks, what does that impact look like? But the key thing there was, when we look at the Critical Infrastructure Act, those varying maturity levels of organisations is what the government's trying to standardise and move forward, right? And that's a big part of what the agenda is for that act.
Absolutely, and when you're busy generating power or cleaning water and pumping water, adding fluoride or chlorine, a lot of those processes are now automated and driven by PLCs that run chlorinators and fluoride injection machines, and those processes are monitored internally and can be monitored externally, and that external monitoring capability, through its very nature, creates risk. And organisations now, and this is where one of the things I'm a big supporter of in the Act, is organisations starting at that risk assessment phase to start to get them to just identify assets, identify people, process, and technology there. And where that's been lacking in the past, we're now putting a stake in the ground that says, okay, this is actually where we are. So the federal government has come in and launched the Act. They've done it in two parts. The first part is to enable ASD, or Home Affairs, to be able to step in and help organisations that are in strife, that are running through a cyber incident. And the second part is going to be more about embracing standards and putting together a program of work to enable an organisation to be as robust as possible. But we'll probably come back and talk a little bit more about that later. And the areas where the major threat is coming from is still the hacktivists, disgruntled insiders. The cyber criminals are going to continue with ransomware launches all over the world. It's a global problem. It's not just isolated to us. And then finally, we're seeing nation state attacks on critical infrastructure. And that's really going to get played out in the next few weeks, and is currently underway with the Russia-Ukraine situation. And again, it's still, we won't know the full extent of what's really going on until we see some major impact on utilities within the Ukraine as to whether that's been successful or not. But it's been without having any systems and processes in place to try and prevent or deal with an incident once it's launched, it's very difficult for an organisation to come back from that.
Yeah. So I guess it's twofold. There's the innovation pressure that's happening for organisations wanting to access new technologies and do things in automated and easy ways. We look at things like smart meters for power and those sorts of things. They just make sense. But then making sure that things that we class as critical infrastructure for Australia's economy to continue and life to continue. That's really what this is about protecting, right? The Critical Infrastructure Act's about making sure that these things can sustain and Australia's economy can continue to turn. What was really, I guess, the pressure, I guess, this has now come to the top. We're starting to see a lot of movement and got some things here, amendments to the Critical Infrastructure Act, risk management programs. What was really, do you think, the pressure that's really got the government to look at this more closely?
I think it was a couple of things. I don't think it was any one thing in isolation. I think it was cyber incidents occurring globally, cyber incidents occurring domestically, in and around Australia. I think the Colonial Pipeline attack in the US, whilst that was relatively recent, this act was well and truly in motion before that happened. But it's incidents like that where um, uh, uh, an organisation or a system of national significance could potentially have been compromised, that there needed to be tighter controls and management process in place. And we'll talk about this a bit later, but I think that's one of the big reasons why standards are going to be embraced by organisations, particularly in these sectors, so that organisations can start to build out that checklist of things that they need to do in order to be as robust as possible. I think that these sectors that have come into scope now, I think the Minister for Home Affairs has given themselves power to deal with things with systems of national significance, so that we don't disrupt food chain, water supply, power generation, all the things that, for all intents and purposes, we kind of take for granted because they're just always on. We need to protect those, and their thing from all the different kinds of threats. And if we don't have proper systems and processes and technology in place, they are vulnerable and will remain vulnerable.
And it is a lot about, I guess, when you look at some of these sectors and you think, well, what isn't covered in that list? For some organisations, it's also about just getting visibility, I guess, at the executive level or the board level, in terms of, we might not have needed to invest as much in managing these things in the past, but now we're all going on a maturity, I guess, journey together across all the sectors. And I've seen a fair bit of commentary from each one of these different areas when you look at home affairs and what people are concerned about, universities and higher education, where do we pay for these things? But ultimately, it's about everyone progressing forward, right? Not just targeting individual industries in this act.
Oh, absolutely. It's the intent that I'm seeing, and from some of the workshops and town hall meetings I've been on, is whilst from a security point of view, I think there's a way to go. In terms of what they're delivering on, but I'm just delighted that we've got a start and we've got a stake in the ground that says these are the sectors that we deem as being essential for all of us to just carry on a normal life to the best of our ability. Without these things, it's all seriously compromised. And without drilling down on it too far, but without power and water, it's pretty difficult to get going in the morning. And I think that that's going to be something that, and then without having something to eat or getting coffee, I mean, I'm a bit slow without a couple of coffees. So I think we've got to protect our capability to just do things that we, for all intents and purposes, take for granted.
Yeah. So for organisations, I guess, and people that are listening to this, whether live or in the recording, obviously the big thing is I sit in one of those sectors. What does critical infrastructure mean for my organisation? I mean, you've got some commentary here about, I guess, these sorts of three tiers, which is the positive security obligations, mandatory reporting, and risk management. Can you, I guess, talk us through, so an organisation that does now get classed as critical infrastructure, what do these things mean for the organisation?
I think in the first bit, it means that the government's intent is to try and be on the front foot. They're trying not to lead with a big stick as such, but by default, unfortunately, that becomes the is it the carrot or the stick? Look, it's probably a bit of both, and it's probably a bit of both because some organisations don't need the carrot. They're already well and truly mature. They've been embracing standards for over 10 years. They're certified as in a compliant state with things like ISO 27001. They've used the Australian government's ISM, which is a great document. It's complex. But it then comes down to these organisations saying, well, where do we want to sit in that program? Do we want to have a light touch and then use Essential 8 and just have a minimal approach? Or do we want to middle of the road or medium and go to 2001, and the new version of that got released last week? or do we want to go all the way, and do we want to use NIST or 62443 or ISM and start getting over 1,000 controls that they want to try and achieve some sort of compliance state with? And I think in reality, what's going to happen is that organisations will probably find a balance of a little bit of both, so that they might cherry pick controls from multiple standards to come up with their own checklist. And I think one of the reasons why airlines and pilots don't crash planes is because they run through that checklist and they get everything right before they've before they've taken off. From a security point of view, I think we need to do a lot better job of making sure that an organisation has a checklist of guidelines of controls that they need to implement people, process, and technology to achieve a compliant state at, and then their risk will be substantially reduced. Like it's the results, the numbers around the world for organisations that have implemented these programs, their risk of being compromised is substantially reduced. And once you've got that risk embraced, it still doesn't mean you're not potentially going to get compromised. So mandatory reporting is designed that if an organisation hasn't gone through that whole process and they're not able to fully understand what's going on with their event, they have to be able to report on it and seek help. And that part I think is really good, because if the Home Affairs teams and the teams get together and are able to assist an organisation who's unfortunately been compromised or suffering a cyber incident that's halting their operations, they can't generate power, pump water, produce food, ship food, etc., they are potentially compromising the operations of a nation. So that we do need to have systems and processes to protect them. And the mandatory reporting thing, look, I think there's going to be some flexibility here, which is why the risk management program was in Parliament last week, and I believe has passed the lower house and is now being transferred to the Senate. And that, from what I'm hearing, that they're going to try and pass this by the federal election, which I don't know when that's going to be, but the rumour is they're going to try and pass it, which means that an organisation then has to go back, and I'll talk a bit about this program later, but they're going to be able to go back and they'll have time to run through that checklist, assess their maturity, and then start to go through their risk management program and dot the I's and cross the T's on all the controls that they've got in place. And I think certainly for myself, the older I get, the more I need the checklist, because it just takes the guesswork out of what we're doing in security, and it starts to, rather than us being the magic guys in the corner that are trying to keep everything safe, we have a very structured approach. We have clear controls called out and deliverables against those controls that once we've implemented, we can start to really achieve a level of maturity that protects us from all those bad guys that are all over the world and locally trying to mess with us all the time.
Yeah, and as per most, I guess, government organisations or entities that are trying to enforce things, there are obviously penalties and bits and pieces that organisations will apply to. But as you've said, you think there's going to be some flexibility there, because you can't put one blanket rule given the different maturity levels of different businesses.
Yeah, I think they've got to give everybody time to get up to speed, and that's going to that is going to take. We're going to have some organisations that are well and truly mature and that have conducted that risk assessment. They've put together their architectures, and they've got really good incident management and response capability. I think one of the challenging things for organisations to do once they've embraced the standard and worked out where they are is to then implement it. And yes, there's a substantial quantity of documentation, but if they pick the right partner and everybody's in agreement with what the finish line looks like, they can get these programs in place. Look, I think it all depends on the size of the organisation, but it's probably a bit ambitious to call a deliverable time on that. But for a substantial organisation or a mid-sized organisation, it's probably around 12 months.
Yeah.
So I think there won't be any fines or penalties handed out for between 12 and 24 months, depending on how that organisation is conducting themselves against one of these programs. So I think this slide, I like this slide because it just gives us the three requirements of the Act, or principles that I see of the Act, are firstly, an organisation has to conduct a risk assessment to understand what assets they've got in play and what's the maturity level of security or the security posture of those assets, and measure that against a proper standard that's put together by. There's lots of there's 40 to 60 people that help put together these standards that have been evolving for, in some cases, 20 years. They're not just thrown together. These things are mature, they're really good, and they work. I think once that's done, getting that architecture and documentation to deliver against all the controls of the standard is challenging. Putting the systems in place that enable you to get visibility is important, because if something does go wrong, you've got tools that will enable you to detect it and then be able to report on it. But not only report on it, that third phase of being able to manage an incident and maintain it. So an organisation of national significance that has all of these three capabilities in place, for all intents and purposes, is going to have a far better chance of resisting a cyber attack and an incident managing to an organisation that doesn't have any of these things in place. And so that's going to be really good. And the process to get there, I don't think this will be anything new to too many people, but it's really engage the right partner, get that gap analysis done, work out where you are in the journey, put together the scopes that can go to the board, and that means you getting aligned to risk, involving the chief risk officer, who can then take his documentation with the cybersecurity assessment being transferred to a risk register. Once it's on the risk register, the board then has visibility of all the issues. You can then get a proper strategy and budget to go and do an implementation of people, process, and technology that will enable an organisation to not only be compliant, but also be capable with the Act. But bigger picture from the Act, it will also enable an organisation to be able to protect itself and manage a cyber incident, which I think for me is even more important than just an Act to be able to comply with, and then finally test it. And again, that involves getting the right partner on board and doing the walkthroughs. Yeah, one of the hardest things I've done is an incident response plan. Is getting all the key players, the marketing manager, the IT manager, the CEO, the CFO, etc., in the room to walk through what everybody's role is within a cybersecurity incident. And when I finally did that, and I unashamedly lured them with sandwiches and drinks to get into the room, but once I got them in there and we did the tabletop walkthrough of the plan, everybody a lot of eyes were opened as to, oh wow, I really do need to be involved in this. We do need marketing to put the right messaging together to keep customers, not to prevent them from panicking. The CEO does need to be briefed. He does need to know that he's going to get briefed by marketing, and he needs information from IT and from the investigation team. Like it all needs to come together to work in concert to manage an incident. And the ones that I've been involved in, the management teams have been substantially stressed. And I think that the reason why they were is because they didn't have a lot of these programs in place in the first place. And it really does make a big difference to have all these walkthroughs done.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's one of the key takeaways that I took from this as well. And we did a webinar recently about ISO 27001 as a good starting point to baseline where you're up to, irrespective of whether it's critical infrastructure or not. But I think the key point we took from there is that risk assessment's really important to start before you start making investments in technology. Understanding what you need, which, I think sometimes it's the other way around. We look at the technology to try and solve a problem, but we're not quite sure of what problem we're solving yet.
Yeah, I'm guilty. I've done that. That's exactly what I did.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So look, I mean, this just gets back to the first question I asked of, how does that sort of fit into, where Fortinet sits from your perspective? So talk us through this, because I know it's quite a complex slide, but this is really about, I guess, maybe a single pane of glass of how this process works once you've gone through that risk assessment and gone on that journey, the things you're actually trying to protect and how the technologies relate. So do you want to talk us through the middle here, the Purdue model?
Sure. So look, I apologize for the content of this slide because I've probably put too much. I'm breaking a few rules. But the center of this slide, that model in the center is the Purdue model. I'm sure a lot of people have seen that before as an academic construct of what a operational technology architecture looks like. It gives you that visibility from the cloud zone, from the external zone to the 5 and 4 being the enterprise zone. And then the bottom from 3 down, from 3 to 0, is the operational technology zone. And what the reason why I think it's a good construct to have there is it will constantly refer to that when we're talking about the cybersecurity program of work, several use cases and things that we can put together to help ensure that architecture is as robust as possible. And then when we talk about individual products that Fortinet does and why our security mesh, our security fabric enables a lot of this program to work. So in the interest, I'll just flip through the program. Firstly, is to conduct a risk assessment. We've already talked about that. Then get that strategy to the board, get buy-in on it, and then I still think security architecture documentation is one of the hardest components. It's using a SABSA or a TOGAF model to be able to document the business requirements and then align with full traceability from top to bottom as to what a business requirement is and why we've got a bit of technology in our architecture, and then how we're going to manage that technology. Once we've got that done, we can then do a proper implementation, again, making sure that it has that whatever we implement is fully traceable to business requirements and a management layer. This is where Fortinet sits. We are the component layer of a security architecture, where tools and applications that enable organizations to achieve this program of work at the end of the day. And then the monitoring and incident response capability. It's really important for organizations trying to be compliant and capable with the Act that they can see what's there, including some of the shadow IT that's kicking around in IT and OT, and then put together a training program. And I like adding in the training because if we do training in 2 parts, basic training and security awareness, that should be done for anybody who has access to our architecture. And then secondly, internal policy and procedure is training people on all the documentation we produce in the architecture documentation phase. And this helps us try to build out that culture. Like, safety is now quite mature in a lot of organizations. We need to try and uplift security and build that human firewall and security culture. I think the only way we're going to achieve that is with training, but at the same time, having the right tools. So what Fortinet's done is we've evolved our value over 20 years of next gen firewall experience to produce applications like deception, endpoint protection, SIEM. These kinds of tools enable us to see what's going on, report it, and then manage it. So that enables us out of the box to be compliant with standards and with the Act. And I think that's going to add enormous value to clients as they jump on this journey and start to go through that process.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that the key takeaway there is, again, customers will be buying certain elements that already exist within the security mesh. But if you are classed as critical infrastructure and making sure that you're meeting those obligations, using this process to then dictate what is the actual tool that I need to solve the thing that I'm trying to solve, I think that's a really good opportunity for businesses to build that business case to say there's a reason we're buying this technology, not just it's nice to have monitoring, it's nice to have event management. What's it actually connecting to, and how's that protecting us as a business as well? Yeah, awesome. Awesome. Well, look, from my perspective, I guess the other part was, we've probably got some businesses that are watching this, organizations that are watching this. How does the Act roll out? So businesses are obviously notified that you are now classed as critical infrastructure. And if so, certainly they can reach out to us and have a conversation more specifically about their needs, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So we will work with you with any client that wants to embrace the journey. There are still some organizations that are not quite sure whether they're in scope or not.
Yeah.
I would say it's going to be very difficult for an organization to out of scope itself if they fit into one of those categories. And one thing that we didn't really talk about earlier, but I've got to throw in to add to that, is that their supply chains are also can be written into scope. by home affairs at any point in time. So that, embracing a standard, it covers things like supply chain. So, in that statement of applicability, you're really going to start to drill down on some of these things and put together the right people, process, and technology to ensure that you can get that posture up, which is what the intent of the whole act really is all about.
Yeah, awesome. Now, look, we've moved through that quite quickly today. So please, anyone who wants to reach out with any questions or bits and pieces, please do so. We're certainly here to help and assist. But thank you so much for taking us through that process, which I think the key takeaway was doing that risk assessment and choosing some controls or frameworks to align to is going to really help inform how you can meet any of those mandatory requirements, but also invest in the right technologies to deliver those outcomes as well. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk us through that today, Andrew.
Pleasure, Simon. Great to be here. And yeah, if anybody wants to reach out and get, they can contact me via LinkedIn or go through Soren and go through the guys at Secure Agility, and we can put together a session and go through where your current state is and where you would like to be and how we can help you get there on the journey.
That's absolutely awesome. And look, guys, we run these sessions monthly. If there's any topics in particular that you would like for us to talk through, send through an email at inform@secureagility.com. We'll certainly take that feedback on board and hopefully deliver some great topics. So thank you everyone for your time today, and thank you again, Andrew, for your time.
Pleasure. Great to be here. Thanks.
Cheers, guys. Bye.